Welcome. I am Rich Stolz, and I'm the Executive Director of OneAmerica, organization based in Washington State, committed to building the power of immigrant and refugee communities. OneAmerica is a proud member of the National Partnership for New Americans. And it's a true pleasure to be here today. This panel is called Beyond Solidarity, Fighting White Nationalism and Powering Intersectional Justice. And that covers a lot of ground. So let me take a moment to explain what we'll be covering this afternoon. This session will highlight the need to center racial justice and the need to build intersectional solidarity to fight back against white nationalist anti-democratic movements across the United States. We have some fabulous speakers, but first I just wanted to ground us a little bit in what we're all experiencing in this moment. It appears that we do have a new president. And while President Trump is gone, Trumpism remains a potent political and cultural force in our nation. There have been growing movements, both on the right and the left. The immigrant rights movement in some ways is stronger than ever. It's also happening at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement is also a very potent force. But counter to that is the white supremacist movement and nationalist movements. And we've seen clashes already among these various actors. But we know as a movement that we win by coming together, by breaking down physical and psychological barriers, by building connection and a sense of belonging. That matters deeply to our movement. And we need to understand how others may seek to divide us. So today, we have several fabulous speakers I'm very proud to present that will share some of their own insights and knowledge in this intersection of competing movements and narrative and the need to go beyond solidarity, but to really understand each other. So first I want to introduce Rinku Sen, who is the Executive Director of the Narrative Initiative. Rinku is an old friend, wonderful and powerful woman who has been in the movement for quite some time, who I know back to when she was running Color Lines, which is an important magazine and document of the movement for racial justice.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Rich, so much for including me in this wonderful panel. I'm really excited to speak on this with these wonderful colleagues and at this excellent conference that has played such an important role in the life of immigrants and in the life of the immigrant rights movement. I'm going to talk to you today about how I plot through a general communication strategy and show you a couple of examples of that, and then point to some of the things that I think immigrant rights organizations, activists, leaders, speakers, scholars could really pay attention to in our communications in the next period as we are fighting white nationalism and white supremacy in the immigration policy debate. So I'm going to start by just talking to you about how I think of a communication strategy and what things I put in it, what the elements are of it. When many of us plan out communication strategy, we start with the message and we obsess and test and try out different messages. But when I start to think about how and what I'm going to communicate on any particular part of immigration issues, I have three elements that I'm always trying to figure out. The first is, what is the frame going to be? How am I going to frame my communication? The second is, what are the stories that I'm going to tell? What's the narrative going to be? And the third, and only last, after I figured out frame and stories, am I going to focus on the messages? So what are these three elements? What do they actually mean, these words mean? The frame is a worldview. It's a mental model of how the world works. So in our frames, we might think, no good deed goes unpunished. That is a worldview or a frame that's very pessimistic, that says, don't do anything for anybody else because you'll never be rewarded for that. A phrase or a sentence or a few words that evoke for people a particular mental model is the frame. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this in a second. Inside the frame, in order to make that mental model work and get reinforced for people, you want to tell stories. The human brain is tightly geared toward stories. From the time we started communicating with each other, we have been telling stories. And that's because stories aren't just entertainment for us. The human brain does like to be entertained, though. Stories are the way that we understand morality, what is the right thing to do at any given point, what are the consequences of decisions that I might make and things I might do. All of that gets worked out through the form of a character, a plot, as in things that happen, a setting where the story is taking place, and a moral, a point of the story, a moral of the story, the lesson of the story. So we have our frame, which is our big worldview. We have our stories, which reinforce and illustrate that worldview. And then finally, we will have our messaging or our messages, which are about the actions that you want people to take upon hearing or watching or listening to your or reading your story. So let's pull up the first slide and we can take a look at an example. When I worked at Race Forward some years ago, in 2011, we released the first report on how many children of immigrant parents were in foster care simply because their parents had been deported, not because of neglect or abuse, but really just because the parent was absent, having been deported. And what we were dealing with, the dominant frame on immigration issues and immigration policy at the time, was a law and order frame. Every immigration story, every piece of policy, every speech from the anti-immigrant side focused on law and order and how and was full of stories about immigrants breaking the law and doing harm. So we wanted to reframe that debate from being solely, entirely about law and order to being about family unity, about the cohesion and the life of families and the right that families have to stay together. So the narratives or stories in the law and order frame, as I mentioned, were all about immigrants breaking the law. Sometimes those stories were true, and quite often the stories were not true. We tell the truth, but not everybody who communicates on these issues does. So lots and lots of stories, true and false, about immigrants breaking the law. We told stories about immigrants whose families had been broken, in fact, by the law, and how they struggled to keep their families together. So our stories were often about immigrants who were in detention, whose kids were maybe with a relative, and who then got deported and moved around throughout that whole process in ways that prevented them from reuniting with their kids. But the agency of those parents and those families was really important to us. And so in addition to the breaking, we tried to reveal in the stories how they were also fighting. And then our messages, the message of the anti-immigrant crowd was detain and deport more and more and more people. Our messages were to keep families intact by ending mass deportation. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you another example. In 2010, Race Forward started the Drop the Iword campaign, and our goal was to get the Associated Press, which is the outlet of record and an outlet that has a style guide that is used by thousands of other news outlets around the world, and certainly in the United States. So we wanted the Associated Press to take the phrase illegal immigrant and all of its iterations, illegal as a noun, etc., illegal alien, all of its iterations out of their style guide as an acceptable way to talk about immigrants who were undocumented or who had crossed the border or overstayed a visa. So again, the dominant frame was a law and order frame. When the right wing insisted that news outlets use illegal immigrant, quote unquote, illegal immigrant, they also insisted that that was the correct terminology, that it was just the law. And in order for us to respect the law, we had to just repeat that phrase again and again and again. Our frame was a human dignity frame. And you'll remember that we were running a campaign that was essentially about journalistic practice. So our argument was that every human being has the right to be represented fairly and the right to be not misrepresented in media that is about them. That is a core human right, to be able to represent yourself and to not have other people put on you a label that isn't accurate, that doesn't belong to you. So that was our frame, human dignity. The narratives, again, on the right-wing side, all about breaking the law. Our narratives were about immigrants who had been harmed by the bias embedded in the words illegal immigrant and how they were fighting back against that bias. And then the messaging on the right-wing side was, you must use only the I word, whereas our message was, there are plenty of great alternatives that are accurate and that preserve the human dignity of the person being reported on. So in these two examples, you can see that the frame is a worldview. It's based on a shared value. Granted, it's not shared, those values are not shared by everyone, including the people on the anti-immigrant side, but they are shared by many, many, many people who might not yet understand how that value translates into taking a position on mass deportation, or in this case, the uses of the I word. So thank you so much for listening to that very quick and dirty immigration lesson. I'm going to move on now to a few things that you want to consider as you're crafting these frames and stories and messages. You want to remember that the purpose of all our communication is to drive people to action. And in order to drive people to action, we have to work to generate the emotion in them that is going to make them actually take an action, sign a petition, go to a rally, sign up for deportation defense, whatever it is that you want people to do. So some emotions are actually depressing of action. If your communication strategy is one sad story after another, you might actually be giving the impression that nothing can be done about these policies and that all we can do, we immigrants can do, is suffer. So you want to always balance the reality of the trauma that people are experiencing, the violence that is directed toward them, with their agency in fighting back and in preserving their families and preserving their own human dignity. So outrage can be a motivating emotion. Remorse can be a motivating emotion. So someone who thinks, well, I used to think about immigrants this way and in this negative way, and now I know that that was inaccurate and wrong, and I feel bad about the ways that I contributed to making life harder for immigrants, and I'm going to take a new action to change that. Remorse can actually be motivating. So you just want to think a little bit as you craft your stories and craft your frames about how you want people to feel and how that feeling is going to drive them to do something. You want to make sure that your stories and your frames don't contradict each other. So if your frame on immigration is human dignity or freedom, you don't want all your stories to then be about how much of a contribution immigrants make to the economy. Immigrant contributions, economic contributions are somewhat transactional. They're about the self-interest of Americans and of the US. And they're not necessarily about human dignity unless you make it so. So you just want to make sure we're not telling stories that somehow undermine the values that we're attempting to push in our framing. And then the last point I want to make here is that in immigration discourse, particularly throughout this pandemic period, we've heard a lot about the disparate impact of the pandemic and of pandemic policies and lack of policies on immigrant workers who are deemed essential workers and without whom we wouldn't have food on our tables, we wouldn't be healed when we go to the hospital, we wouldn't have children taken care of, and help at home for elderly and disabled people. So it's very easy, though, when we make a disparate impact point that X group of people is disproportionately negatively affected by some piece of policy. It's very easy for people who don't have the background on the system to put the blame on the people who are suffering themselves, to blame the victim. So I can't tell you how many times through the pandemic period I saw people say, well, if you can't be an essential worker right now because you have people at home who are vulnerable and have immune issues or are other health issues, then you should find yourself another job. You should just stop doing that job and find yourself another job. Well, there aren't a lot of other jobs for folks who are currently in essential work roles. But if I don't understand that and I'm reading your disparate impact data, I may come to the wrong conclusion about why this is happening. So it's really important if we're making that if we're basing our communication strategy on disproportionate impact, that we emphasize systems that are actually causing that impact, and that we, again, emphasize the agency and the actions of the people who are affected by that problem. So I'm going to wrap up here and just remind us of what I've talked about. When you're crafting a communication strategy, it's not just about the message. And in fact, the message might not even be where you want to start. You start with thinking about how you're going to frame the issue, what stories you have to tell, and only then when you are clear about what you want people to do you go to craft your messages. Your frame is going to stay as consistent as possible, but the stories and the messages can change based on your audience and based on where you are in your campaign effort and what you need people to do right now. As a field, I'm going to encourage us to really tell our stories, and in thinking about how we're going to tell them, also think about how we're going to distribute them. How are people going to find our stories? Is that going to be on social media? Are you going to send out press releases? Are you going to produce a report? Are you going to make 10 one-minute long videos? Which platforms are you going to put those communications out on? So frame, story, messages, Don't contradict yourself inside them. Think about the emotions that you need to engender in folks, and then tell them on the platforms that are going to get them the widest distribution and listenership, viewership, readership possible. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to you, Rich.
I also want to introduce Lindsay Schubiner from the Western States Center, who serves as their Momentum Program Director. And Lindsay's been a valuable resource here in the Northwest, but also across the country, on what the right and white nationalist movements are up to.
Thank you so much, Rich, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm really honored to be here with you at this moment in history when, in the midst of climate change and a deadly pandemic and rising hate violence, we're here to talk about the crucial issues of how to protect our communities and our civil rights by countering the influence of white nationalism and other anti-democratic movements. At Western States Center, we are focused on strengthening inclusive democracy, and we do work to counter white nationalism because we see it as a threat, both to the safety of our communities and to the future of inclusive democracy itself. Right now, in this moment, we're facing a great deal of possibility and a lot of risk, too. Social movements for justice have built power and greater consensus around key racial justice issues. We know now the majority of Americans believe in inclusive democracy. The majority of Americans believe that Black Lives Matter. 67% of US adults expressed support for the Black Lives Matter movement over the summer, and a majority still do. We're in an era of massive mobilization for change. And at the same time, white nationalist, paramilitary, and anti-immigrant movements have also become stronger over the past 4 years. We know from an historical perspective that paramilitary movements tend to grow under Democratic administrations. That doesn't necessarily mean it will happen over the next 4 years here, but it does mean that we can't stop organizing and we can't take our eyes off the ball. We still have a white nationalist movement to contend with if we want to build a radically inclusive democracy in this country, at the same time that we have to work to dismantle white supremacist systems that have been present in our institutions since the beginning of this country. And that's an important distinction that we make at Western States Center between white nationalism and white supremacy. So I want to talk about it really briefly. We understand white supremacy as a system of oppression based on slavery and genocide that goes back to the founding of the United States and still operates at a structural and an individual level. White nationalism, on the other hand, we understand as a social movement with the end goal of creating an all-white ethno-state within the United States. It absolutely benefits directly from structural white supremacy, but it's still a social movement, and it originally came about as a backlash to the civil rights movement. Sort of once legally upheld racial discrimination was overturned and morphed into de facto structural discrimination, early white nationalists turned away from reinforcing white supremacist structures as their primary goal, though they still supported them. And they instead oriented toward creating a separate all-white nation within the US through violence and policies that increase the vulnerability and criminalization and removal of people of color and other targeted communities. And so today, white nationalism operates as a bigoted social movement that aims to build political power towards its goal of a white nation. So they're not just spreading hate. They certainly are, but they're spreading hate as a way to build power. And white nationalism is distinct from white supremacy, which is a system of oppression designed to maintain control over people of color and the rights of all women. So our work is based on understanding that we have to tackle both white supremacy and white nationalism, but we have to use different tools to do it. As our executive director, Iword, often says, you might say a cow and a Big Mac are made of the same thing, but if your Big Mac falls on the floor, you wouldn't call a veterinarian to help, right? So we have these two interrelated barriers to creating a just multiracial democracy. And I want to talk a little bit about what tools and strategies we can think about using to counter white nationalism specifically in our communities and institutions. And there are a few strategies that we keep coming back to. Definitely not an exhaustive list, but you know, they've been, I think, really important for us to think about strategically. The first is know your opposition, right? So white nationalists and associated movements like the alt-right and paramilitary movements, anti-immigrant movements, they're related, right? But they're not exactly all the same. They use different kinds of communication strategies. They use different tactics. Some work more through the legal system. Others work by building grassroots power or using violence in the streets. And we can develop strategies to block their progress based on an understanding of their tactics and goals. So, for example, a group we worked with in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, wanted to respond to a spate of white nationalist flyering targeting businesses in the downtown area. And we knew based on their tactics and who they were and their communications that their intent was really to spread propaganda, to normalize their white nationalism and bigotry, and to intimidate anyone who might think about speaking in opposition to them. So local organizers and businesses organized a sign-on campaign to publicly repudiate bigotry, spurred by the flyers, and built something more positive. Right, came out publicly together so that no one could be targeted or intimidated specifically because they were doing it as a group, and to take some of that fear and intimidation away. Another strategy that we focus on is isolating, interrupting, and exposing white nationalists and alt-right actors. There's an example we worked on a couple years ago where information came to light about how a member of a local GOP had praised and hosted an overt white nationalist at a meeting. And we worked with local organizers to publicize it, to urge quick action from local elected officials, and that a member of the local GOP party ended up being forced to step down within 48 hours, along with other ideologically aligned members of the local party. The next strategy is competing for grassroots power. So, it's important, I think, to not give up on people or especially entire geographies, right? A lot of times people turn to far-right movements based on isolation or because they're the only game in town. So we have to focus, I think, on offering an alternative that is vibrant and inclusive and focused on our values in a lot of different places. We also have to move institutional power to build a consensus around bigotry, right? So this is one of the reasons why we're so strongly focused on strengthening democratic institutions, because if those institutions aren't strong or aren't present, whether they're schools or libraries or community organizations or other civic organizations, that makes space for paramilitary groups or other far-right groups to move in and organize, right? Including sometimes, providing services to people that aren't provided through other institutions or means. This fall, there was an alt-right and paramilitary event planned in Portland, and we were really concerned about the possibility of violence based on heightened tensions and rhetorics. And so we sent a sign-on letter to the city's mayor and council, the governor, and other elected officials asking them to take swift action. And the city responded really quickly. They worked with the Portland Bureau of Transportation to position traffic signs reading "Hate has no place here" and "Black Lives Matter" around the location of the event to indicate a government and institution opposition to the event and support for inclusive values. and organized a joint statement including the entire city leadership and some state level leaders denouncing white nationalism and paramilitaries explicitly, and committing to investigating an escalation in legal options to keep Portland communities safe. So that kind of, strengthening of institutions is really important. We see a lot of opportunities to use rapid response as a way to create broader change, right? Even as we seek to create deep change in our communities, there are strategies for rapid response interventions that can be really effective in closing the political space for white nationalism to operate at a moment where there's a lot of attention on a specific issue, and sort of quick action with a strong narrative centered on values can really create opportunities for deeper and longer change when we're all ready as organizers for a response to those crisis moments. Finally, it's important to manage backlash. There's usually going to be backlash to any progressive victories or racial justice victories that we win. So we have to plan for it in our organizing, right? Our campaign shouldn't end when we've won a policy or legislative victory. We also have to manage the response to that victory for the far right, so we don't lose it, right? And we've been in conversation with certainly some organizers who've in the past seen that happen, seen backsliding from policy or legislative victories, and then next time prepared better and more explicitly for how to blunt the impact of far right and anti-democratic and racist movements. The last thing I want to say is that it's important to build really broad and diverse coalitions and to guard against wedges, right? Because we see sometimes white nationalists or far right movements try to wedge progressive movements. For instance, anti-Muslim groups, not just using LGBTQ rights and violence against women as talking points, but actually trying to break off parts of progressive constituencies. And I think right now there's a real concern about QAnon conspiracy theories and their reach, which is significant and not isolated to the far right. So moving into 2021, we're going to need to keep all of these things in mind to blunt the impact of white nationalist and anti-immigrant movements as we seek to reverse the dangerous policies of the Trump administration. And we can also do some planning in advance, keeping in mind a few likely trends from anti-immigrant and white nationalist movements. For instance, I think we're likely to see some increase in anti-refugee organizing and rhetoric, not just from the usual anti-refugee, anti-immigrant suspects, but also from a broader range of paramilitary and white nationalist organizations, especially following President-elect Biden's pledge to resettle more refugees per year than President Obama. I think there's a likely shift that we've already started seeing for paramilitary movements, armed groups unaccountable to any democratic body, seeking to build power politically by opposing pandemic safety measures like masks and shutdowns. And I think we're also likely to see some renewed efforts to frame immigrant rights as supposedly extreme, combined with attempts to reach some communities of color and some people who might see themselves as liberal. And I think this is likely to be boosted by this, in the increased reach of conspiracy theories. But despite this, there's a real opportunity to make significant progress towards justice now, as long as we can manage, right? Not ignore, not center, but manage white nationalist and anti-immigrant movements to blunt their impact. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're in an era of huge mobilizations and significantly shifting public opinion for racial and economic justice. And that doesn't mean that 73 million Trump voters are going to disappear or suddenly change their minds, but it does mean that, as our executive director, Eric Ward, has written, we are in the early stages of the inclusive, multiracial democracy that so many have fought and died for, something no other country of our size has yet achieved. I really do believe that we can achieve it, though, if we can consolidate our progress and manage the anti-democratic backlash long enough to finish building a strong movement for a just, inclusive, and multiracial democracy that leaves no one out. Thank you so much.
And now I want to introduce Kayse Jama, the Executive Director of Unite Oregon. Kayse is a powerful immigrant leader in Oregon, but also nationally, and he is also a candidate for public office.
Thank you so much, Rich, for your introduction. Really appreciate. My name is Kayse Jama. I'm the Executive Director of Unite Oregon. I'm going to just build on what Rinku and Lindsay actually framed and created for us. So let me tell you a little bit what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the focus around how do you build a multicultural, multiracial movement in order to counteract the white supremacy and white nationalism. I think it's important that we have to build a movement to counteract. So I'll maybe take a few minutes to share a little bit about my organization, Unite Oregon, and why we are focused around building multicultural, multiracial movement for justice. Our organization, when we started about 20 years ago, we were mainly focusing around counteracting white Islamophobia and making sure that immigrant refugee communities have created a space that they can organize collectively. But at the beginning, when I went around the state and really talked to a lot of different leaders in the organizations, what I realized that even though we have a lot of strong culturally specific organizations who are important, doing important work, we were also segregated as a movement. So there's very limited space where we can bring people who are from different backgrounds coming together and working together collectively to build power. And that's why Unite Oregon became a space that we can create that kind of a movement. For the last 20 years, we really created spaces where we train and train diverse community members to really create some sort of common agenda, collectively to work together. So let's move forward right now. As part of that strategy, one of the things that I'm going to create a little bit about, tell you a story about, give you a couple examples of how do you build a strong multicultural, multiracial movement without also making sure that you actually making sure that you center your movement around racial justice without losing the sight of that. We have to make sure that whatever movement we are building is actually centered around racial justice as organizations and as a movement. So give you a couple examples in terms of the policy level and coalition building. In around 8 years ago or so, Unite Oregon was involved in creating a table called Fair Choice Coalition. And Fair Choice Coalition was really brought together by labor and community groups who you sometimes don't work together. So when we created that table, the goal was really to address around racial justice, gender justice, and economic justice issues, and then create some sort of a policy agenda together collectively to push together. Through that process, we were able to really create and pass strong policies that really have centered around racial justice, but also benefits all. So, for example, paid family leave, no-cost evictions, and profiling. Those kind of type of policies were kind of around centering around make sure that racial justice is center, but also is creating also benefiting, as I said earlier, for all communities. So that's kind of an example that you can build a strong partnership with different unusual, sometimes suspects that you can bring together to work together common agenda. Another example that I want to give you is that it just recently, this November in Oregon, we passed a measure that criminalizes possession of a small amount of usable drugs. And really that measure, Unite Oregon works as a field organization, and we were able to actually work around 32 counties out of the 36 counties in the state, building field organizers who are really engaging diverse community to ensure that the measure passes. And really the measure, what it does, really a couple things. One, it criminalizes small amount of usable drugs, as I said earlier. But the second thing is that actually creates treatment programs around the state. And what we also did find out that in terms of when we asked our Criminal Justice Commission, Organized Criminal Justice Commission, to analyze the impact of racial impact of the measure, that it actually reduced disparities about 94% of the Black disparities around both arrest and convictions. Similarly, it actually 94% reduced the disparities between Native American and the white counterparts, and really both arrests and convictions. But at the meantime, also it did actually create a space where over 90% of the white folks who had been charged or convicted were also eliminated out of the process. So the measure what it is actually, it created a very strong racial justice central ballot initiative, but also benefited for all communities. And those kind of the examples that really what can help us to build a strong movement for justice. And that's what United Organs is actually centered around, making sure that the leadership of the organization and it's centered around racial justice, but we're also creating, as I said earlier, policies that are all benefiting all communities. And those are a couple examples that I want to give to you. Second, final point that I'm trying to take is that what have we learned for the last 4 years? I think it's really important and prudent that we have to think about lessons we have learned for the last 4 years, which is that we cannot allow silo organizing. We really have to come together as a community and build a multicultural, multiracial movement for justice. So we don't end up in situations where we end up last 4 years. And that's the only way, even though we might have a new administration who might be friendly to our issues that we care about, we have to ensure that we don't let our guards down. We have to think about long-term strategy. And that strategy has to be included, centered most impacted communities, but more importantly, that is movement that's multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, and the type of agenda and policies that we're creating is also benefiting all communities. That's kind of a couple examples that I want to give how to address some of the contrasting the white supremacy and white nationalism, and I will stop there. Thank you.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ruth Milkman. Ruth Milkman is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And Ruth has done some important work in the field of immigrant labor and narrative, and how the immigrant threat has been used to divide communities against each other. Let me turn it over to Ruth to further introduce herself and to describe her important work.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. I guess I'm the one academic included. And what I want to do in my brief time today is share with you some research that I've developed in some detail in the book that you see listed on the left side of the screen, Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, which came out earlier this year. And the other book is not yet out, but will be in April. And that's an edited book that includes a short summary of the first book. So for those of you who are short of time to read, you might want to look at that one, which is an excellent volume, as you can see, edited by me, as well as Deepak Bhargava, who many of you know, and Penny Lewis. My inquiry starts with this following question. How are the developments I'm about to list for you related, historical developments that began in the mid-1970s? One is immigration itself, which, as you all know, rose pretty dramatically in that period after the law changed in 1965. And I'm especially focused on low-wage immigration and unauthorized immigration. The other thing that happened at the same time was dramatic restructuring of the US labor market, including what I call the 3 Ds: deindustrialization, deunionization, and deregulation. And it was also a period when the non-college educated US-born working class faced rising precarity and instability. And finally, this was a period, as I'm sure you're all very well aware of, skyrocketing inequality and polarization between the haves and the have-nots. So the book and article try to interrogate the connection between these things. One answer to that question of how these different things are related, which is my target of critique, is what I call and others call the immigrant threat narrative. And it goes something like this. Immigrants, especially unauthorized immigrants, are, quote, taking American jobs. And that the influx of immigrants in this period is the cause of the reversal of fortune that US-born workers have suffered. This narrative also argues that growing immigration leads to rising crime, drains resources at the expense of taxpayers in the form of extra costs for health and education and welfare. And also they argue it has bad effects on US culture. So you've all been hearing a lot about this the last 4 years. Right-wing populists in general have promoted and exploited this narrative. But I want to emphasize that that began long before Trump became president, and it will not end on January 20th. Just as a reminder, this is a sort of extreme example of, well, maybe it's not that extreme, but an example of that narrative. You probably remember this from back in 2018. Open borders have allowed drugs and gangs, I can't imitate the guy's voice, to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They have caused the loss of innocent lives. They have allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. So that's basically from the labor end, the argument, and he has said worse things than this. So in addition to the right-wing version available daily on Fox News and so on, this narrative is also echoed in some progressive political commentary. And so I just want to highlight that because I think it's very misleading there too, even though it's well-intentioned. So here are two examples. One is from a recent book by John Judas called The Nationalist Revival, basically saying the same thing that the quote I just showed you from Donald Trump says. Unskilled immigrants are competing with jobs with Americans, leading to the downgrading. Notice the causality. Have led to the downgrading of occupations that were once middle class. That's exactly what I'm going to criticize in a moment. And here's another one from a piece you might have seen last year by Joanne Nagel. There's no, and this is, you know, very much a left-wing perspective. There's no getting around the fact, she says, that the power of unions relies on their ability to restrict and withdraw the supply of labor. And that ability, she argues, becomes impossible if an entire workforce can be easily and cheaply replaced. Open borders and mass immigration are a victory for the bosses. So that's the narrative that I am trying to counter in the rest of this talk. Oh, actually, there's a few more examples, I'm sorry, of its pervasiveness. So even though economists agree, and I'm sure many of you have seen the National Academy of Sciences report that belabors this ad infinitum, that the net impact of immigration on the U.S. economy is actually positive, contrary to this narrative. Still, there are scholars who validate the threat narrative. So one example is an old book by Vernon Briggs, an economist actually, who argues that it's not a coincidence that the period when immigration was restricted between 1924 and 1965 is also the period when the labor movement flourished. And Jeff Cowie, a historian at Vanderbilt, more recently makes the same kind of argument. So that's, you know, out there in many different forms, that narrative. And the timing, if you just look at these claims about unionization, certainly seems to support these claims. Unionization indeed declines dramatically just as immigration rises after the 1970s. But correlation is not causation, and I'm going to try to present a different argument that I think could be useful both in the kind of deep canvassing that you're going to hear about shortly from our next speaker, Emily, as well as in other forums, both written and oral. So what I argue in the book I mentioned and in the article is that the influx of low-wage immigrants is a consequence more than a cause of labor market restructuring, union decline, and rising inequality. And so the basis of this claim that I'm making is that, first of all, low-wage immigration is driven by employer demand, economic demand for low-wage labor. And that demand exploded in many, many industries that were affected by the changes that took place in the neoliberal period, my 3 Ds, deregulation, deunionization, not so much in deindustrialization. And the key here is that US-born workers exited jobs once they became undesirable, if they could, and many could. And then a separate strain of argument is that growing inequality and the expansion of job opportunities for African American women also increased demand for immigrants in sectors that they had previously been confined to, especially domestic work, paid domestic work. So the immigrant threat narrative reverses this causality and, I argue, distracts attention from these economic and political dynamics. I believe that US-born workers who have suffered from labor degradation have every reason to be enraged, but they should be directing their anger not at immigrants, but rather at employers. So let me just walk you through a few more details about this. As I think everyone listening to this knows, in the 1980s especially, and starting a little bit before that, as capital fled the United States and plant closings became an epidemic, that was disastrous for many US-born working people. By the way, no one suggests that that spurred the growth in immigration, right? I mean, factory closings, why would that draw immigrants? But still, it's sort of embedded in the narrative. In this same period, labor unions were anathema to employers and to people directing public policy, market fundamentalists, some of us call them. And this is a quote from David Harvey, labor had to be disciplined, if not destroyed, in the name of the sacrosanct individual liberty of the laborer. And then at the same time, deregulation removed legal constraints that held up labor standards in many cases. And that also led to union decline, for example, in the trucking industry. You probably know that today only 10% of all US workers and only 6% in the private sector are unionized. That all by itself is a major contributor to the kind of labor degradation that we've seen in the last few decades. So the stuff I've written is about low-wage labor, but I just want to read you this example from a New York Times report a couple of years ago that I think is basically the same dynamic. So this is an example. The latest wave of foreign workers sweeping into American jobs brought Donato Soberano from the Philippines to Arizona. He had to pay thousands of dollars to a job broker, lived for a time in an apartment with 5 other Filipino workers. The lure was the pay, 10 times more than what he made doing the same work back home. Mr. Soberano is not a hospitality worker or a home health aide. He is in another line of work that increasingly pays too little to attract enough Americans. Mr. Soberano is a public school teacher. School districts can't find enough American educators willing to work for the pay that's offered. Well, you may remember that shortly after this report appeared, there was a big wave of strikes among public school teachers, including in Arizona. And so that has improved the pay that's offered and so on. But this is the same dynamic that we see in less well-paid positions that don't require college education. So I don't have time to go into all the gory details, but I'm going to give you a couple examples from these industries which are discussed in detail in my book. Trucking, construction, meatpacking, which are mainly employing men, and on the other side of the gender divide, domestic work especially, as well as these other occupations that are dominated by women. So here are some examples of what happened in terms of the exodus of US-born workers from these jobs as they became less and less desirable, thanks to the 3 Ds. So here's a quote from a trade journal, the Journal of Commerce, back in 2005. As long as trucking paid as well as flipping burgers, the chrome and cowboy aspects of the job were reason to be driving. But now fast food jobs look increasingly attractive to many former truck drivers. Qualified drivers are migrating to better paying jobs in truckload, construction, and other sectors. So that's one example. In the construction industry itself, as residential construction was dramatically de-unionized in the 80s and 90s, what happened there was that residential construction workers, US-born ones, abandoned that sector of the industry for commercial construction. And in meatpacking too, which, if those of you who are old enough to remember, was once an industry dominated by US-born workers. Now it's almost completely dominated by Black and brown workers, many of them immigrants. They could not get US-born whites to stay in the job as it was restructured. In paid domestic labor, it's a slightly different story, but again, one of exodus from on the part of U.S.-born workers, in this case, African Americans. With growing inequality, demand for paid domestic labor in various forms has exploded for the reason illustrated by this quote, that it's more possible if the gap between the rich and the poor grows for the rich to hire such people. If there's no difference in their incomes, they can't possibly afford to pay a whole other person their full income. But once we have exploding inequality, it is more and more possible. Meanwhile, in the 1970s, as the civil rights movement pried open the doors to other kinds of jobs for African American women, they fled from domestic service. So you see this statistic here, which is pretty dramatic. In 20 years, from 1960 to 1980, the proportion of employed African American women in domestic work fell from 39% to 5%. It's one of the biggest changes in the labor market we've ever had in the United States. And then, meanwhile, as that occurred, or shortly after that occurred, the sector exploded. Care work became one of the most rapidly growing forms of work, and employers who needed such workers turned to immigrants. So I'm just going to quickly summarize the argument, and again, you can try to read more about it if you're interested in all the gory details. My claim is that immigrant employment, contrary to the immigrant threat narrative, is the result, not the cause, of labor degradation and growing inequality. That US-born workers historically have exited from degraded jobs, and then employers recruit immigrants. In some sectors, domestic work was never a desirable job. It wasn't degraded in this period. It was always a crummy job. But US-born African American women exited because they had other options suddenly in the 1970s. So you get a new equilibrium in the labor market. And again, the anger of US-born workers about the suffering that they have experienced in these decades is completely justified, but misdirected. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ruth. That was fabulous, and a lot to really chew on and think about as we move forward. Next, I'd like to introduce Emily Baird-Chrisohon, who is from Welcoming Tennessee coordinator at the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. She'll help close out our conversation before we get into the Q&A, and she'll be talking about implementation of their deep canvassing project and how they've messaged the issue of immigration in rural and other communities across Tennessee. Emily?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. My name is Emily Baird-Chrisohon, and again, I'm the Welcoming Tennessee coordinator with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition in Nashville. And my role focuses on creating more positive spaces to discuss immigration and help shift the overall narrative to be more pro-immigrant. So I oversee our deep canvassing work at Turk, as well as other strategic narrative shift efforts. And a lot of my role focuses on conversations with what we would call receiving communities or non-immigrant communities. So either helping those who are already supportive plug into our work, or helping move those who aren't supportive further along the spectrum of support. And I just want to take a moment here to mention that at Turk, we have a very multifaceted approach to our work. So we believe that the first priority should always be towards the most directly affected. But at Turk, we also have the resources to invest in an overall narrative shift effort. And what I find helpful about this is that my work then comes out and is accountable to our members in movement. So my work as a non-immigrant white person is directly informed by our base rather than it being siloed into its own entity. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our deep canvassing efforts that were started in 2018. And how we know those efforts work and what makes it successful. So I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone on this call, but across the country, people in power have been using racism, xenophobia, and the fear of undocumented immigrants to win their elections and ignite their supporters. And this fear-based messaging is so effective that most of the time we lose people who are conflicted. So on this slide, you can see headlines and tactics that were used to sway people based on this fear and misinformation. And what's troubling about fear messaging is that fear is a powerful emotion and it's really difficult to combat. So we need to find an equally strong way of engaging people's better instincts and desires. And what we know when combating fear is that facts do not work. I really wish they did. Like, I really wish that I could hand someone a fact sheet about immigration and that they would just become supportive. But that's just not how people work. And we make decisions based on our emotions. So in order to have to affect that decision making, we really need to tap into that emotion rather than pure logic. And deep canvassing does this in a way that better than any way that we've really seen at Turk so far. So I'm not sure if all of you on this call are familiar with deep canvassing. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with GOTV canvassing. So deep canvassing, instead of garnering support for a policy or candidate like GOTV canvassing does, deep canvassing seeks to understand someone's overall view on an issue. And for us, that'd be immigration. So rather than spending 3 minutes at someone's door, you're there for about 10 to 20 minutes. It's like having a relational one-on-one at someone's door. So you're hoping to learn how that voter feels about immigration. And we're also hoping that by giving voters the space to process their concerns in a non-judgmental space, that we can move them to be more supportive. So how do we know deep canvassing works? Anecdotally, we know, right? We know at the door, but we wanted to be a part of an effort that showed concretely that these efforts can work. So Turk was part of a project in 2018 that sought to understand these effects of deep canvassing. And this experiment involved 2 other cities in California and a research team at Berkeley and Yale. And the research team conducted pre and post surveys that voters were unaware were connected to the canvassing. So a voter would receive a survey, and from those that responded, a deep canvassing universe was created. And then the voters were surveyed again after the deep canvassing took place to see if movement had occurred. And again, they were unaware that this survey was connected to the canvasser because the topics of immigration were embedded among other topics. And this allowed us to scientifically measure people's movement over time. And at this time, there had been no other studies conducted utilizing deep canvassing on issues of immigration. So this was a really exciting cutting edge research project to be a part of. Deep canvassing was born out of the marriage equality movement. Some of you might be familiar with deep canvassing's efforts in those regards. But no one knew whether deep canvassing would be effective on issues of immigration. So in deep canvassing, we're really looking to speak to conflicted voters. And what we mean by that are people who are not vehemently opposed nor strong supporters of immigration, but those who hold mixed feelings about undocumented immigrants. And we want to move people on both policy and prejudice. And we're looking to speak or canvass in districts where people voted for Trump around 45 to 65%. So we want to be knocking in precincts where our efforts can really make a difference. So our results, in 2018, we knocked on 3,304 doors and we had 852 conversations. And in combination with the other 2 cities, we showed for the first time that deep canvassing can move voters on immigration in a statistically significant way, and that these results are lasting, which is a big deal. So basically, we're inoculating people to this fear-based messaging that I mentioned earlier. On policies, we move people on 8%, and on bias, we move people on 5%. And when you think about how closely elections are won or lost, this is a hugely significant number. And we also found that these results, again, are lasting a year later. And not only are people moving, but they're also moving people in their households, which is really exciting when you think of what canvassing one person, the impact that can have. Another exciting piece of data is that this impact was essentially the same on voters across every race, gender, age, and political ideology. And the same was true for the effectiveness of the actual canvassers. So just like a lot of people, we had to adjust in this year. we had started our second phase of deep canvassing in January, and then we were about halfway to our goal when a tornado tore through downtown Nashville, and then COVID hit. So we were obviously very sad by everything that was going on and that we couldn't continue our efforts on the doors, but it did give us an opportunity to learn about whether deep canvassing could work over the phone. And what we learned, surprisingly and wonderfully, is that on the phones, our movement rate went from an already meaningful 8% to an incredible 20% movement rate. So if you're worried that this method might not be translatable to our current moment, as I was, we've now seen that deep canvassing over the phones can be as effective, if not more, than canvassing on the doors. So what is it that makes deep canvassing so effective? I really kind of can narrow it down to three things that I think are the most important things to keep in mind when deep canvassing. And that's the power of story sharing, the value of compassion, and then the act of being heard. So my canvassers here, we talk about this all the time and would probably be laughing if they were on the call. But I really believe that the radical act of being heard is central to a successful conversation. And I say radical because to be truly heard and seen in a non-judgmental space is really radical. If you can think of the last time that this happened for you, we really oftentimes don't give this to other people. And we really want people to be able to voice their concerns. So we want to create this space. And it's really the only way that someone can move beyond their concerns is to be able to voice them. So we want to meet them with a non-judgmental attitude, which can be disarming. And something important to keep in mind is that to express an understanding of what the voter is saying is not to confirm their beliefs. This can be tricky at first, but you can reflectively show that you've listened and understood the thoughts of a person you're speaking with without agreeing or confirming what they're saying. In fact, we don't want to agree and confirm a lot of things that sometimes our voters are saying, right? So helpful phrases for this are, so I hear you saying blank, or it seems like blank is really important to you, or it seems like blank is something you're very concerned about. So this is a way we can show that active listening. Story sharing is really important. So a lot of times people are intimidated to enter these conversations with other people because they feel like they don't know enough about the topic at hand. But the good news is that you don't have to be a policy expert to be successful in these conversations. In fact, it might be better if you're not. Movement doesn't require a sophisticated understanding of an issue at hand or a perfect set of talking points. And there's no magical phrase that will move someone. Instead, it just requires that you be willing to enter into a difficult conversation, that you're able to share your personal story with a loved one, and that you're able to sit in the uncomfortable moments and ask deep questions. And we know that this requires a lot of bravery. And something we talk to our canvassers a lot is that we have to be willing to mirror the vulnerability that we want to receive. But this isn't easy. And then lastly is this value of compassion. And the question we ask voters is, when was a time someone showed you compassion when you really needed it? So not a time when you were showed compassion, but a time when someone else showed you that compassion. And this value of compassion is not something that we arrived at overnight. Deep canvassing really hinges on finding the right framing to connect to voters. And so we need to find the value that elicits a personal story in connection to the voter. And this takes time and testing. This is, we took different scripts on the door, what we call a period of iteration. And this time becomes very important because we need to know what is and isn't flowing naturally in these conversations at the doors. So after canvassing for a month and testing over 25 different scripts, and we tested values like sacrifice, belonging, refuge, and struggle, we arrived at the most successful theme of compassion. And this was really a breakthrough moment for us on the doors. So really quickly, I just want to go over the elements of a deep canvas. We don't have a lot of time to delve into it, but just so you get a basic understanding. Initially, we want to, again, ask someone how they truly feel, get out the concerns of this individual in a non-judgmental environment. And the reason that this is important, there's a study by Unbound that was done a couple of years ago that suggests that supporters of the immigrant rights movement is a smaller group than we think. And basically, those that are likely to vote progressively on other issues are not necessarily always with us on immigration. And this is likely because a lot of these individuals still hold conflicting views about immigration, but they never voice them. And generally, if someone never voices these concerns, it makes it really challenging to move beyond them. We also in deep canvassing use this scale you can see at the bottom. And so we're not asking someone, you know, are you just for or against someone? We're asking them to rate themselves on the scale. And this is helpful because people are complicated. Generally, people aren't usually completely for or completely against something. And so this helps us get sort of a feel for where that voter falls, and also keeps them from sort of boxing themselves into one particular belief, but to see that there's reasons for and against why they might be for something. And then again, there's this story change that I mentioned. So we're asking the voter to share their story, and then the canvasser is also sharing their story about immigration and compassion. And so we're wanting to get the voter to this emotional and empathetic space. And then after we've sort of entered into a more emotional space, then we're able to address those initial concerns that the person might have made. And then after that, we finally get to a place where you can offer your opinion and maybe potentially one fact if we feel like it's helpful at that time. So I just want to offer a couple of key learnings from our deep canvassing. That this way of having a conversation is not intuitive. It actually takes a lot of practice. I know that it can feel straightforward, but it's really not the way we naturally speak. We're usually conditioned to think about how to best make our point or argue our facts, but being vulnerable and participating in true active listening really takes practice. The next thing is that I call this, sometimes I'll say this is kind of a little bit of a secret, but whether the person at the door moves actually has little to do with our canvasser. It has little to do with you. And this is something that took me a while of canvassing to understand, that movement of voters actually, to be honest, it really has to do a lot with that individual and the questions that you're able to ask that individual. So it really takes the pressure off. So your job as a canvasser is not to change the mind of the person you're speaking to. Your job is to be present and ask good questions, create moments of story sharing and empathy that shows active listening. And your job is to be willing to undergo and sit in intimidating conversations and difficult moments with a non-anxious presence. But whether that person you're speaking to moves in the end is up to them. Silence is okay. This is challenging for a lot of us. We often feel a need to fill that silence, but giving that silence presents the person with space in order to process. And so it can feel a little awkward at first, but that's perfectly normal. The approach is transformational for both parties. So we hear our canvassers talk a lot about being transformed in the conversations as well as our voters are transformed. And then, as I mentioned earlier, facts alone don't work, and movement is more lasting if someone participates in their own movement. So what I mean by this is that oftentimes during deep canvassing, the voter will end up moving themselves just by being asked good questions. Because a lot of people don't really take time to think through and process how they feel about these issues. So when given that space, they actually talk themselves into a different viewpoint. And the movement is more lasting if this happens. And then we have to stop making assumptions about who and who isn't movable. What we learned from deep canvassing is that few people, though there definitely are some, are completely immovable, but most people are movable if given the right circumstances. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that, again, deep canvassing can be a really impactful experience for canvassers, and it can help your organization build a strong team of invested individuals. But it's important to be attuned to and work with each individual's needs and experiences. I always emphasize this to my canvassers, that physical and emotional safety is so incredibly important, and it's important for them to know when to exit a conversation. And this experience is going to look different depend on one's own embodiment at the door. So a white male's experience and their safety level is going to look very different from a female person of color. And then a person directly affected by the issues being discussed, the emotional toll will be greater for them, right? So this is just very important to keep in mind. And lastly, I just want to mention that we wanted to take our learnings from deep canvassing and figure out a way to a strategy that could work beyond deep canvassing, because deep canvassing does take a lot of resources and not everyone has the time to train to be a deep canvasser. So I wanted to take our learnings and develop a program that would help utilize these tactics for people in their own lives, so that we could train allies in our network to have conversations with their friends, families, and people behind them in the Starbucks line. And I say that because one of our deep canvassers actually did end up deep canvassing someone behind him in the Starbucks line. But so I developed a training called Transformative Conversations that seeks to translate deep canvassing skills to individuals so that they can use them throughout their daily lives in a more shortened training. And we are holding these trainings virtually. So if anyone on this call is interested in attending one of those, we'd be happy to have you. So that's all I have for now.
And here's a question for all of you. What changes or opportunities do you foresee in your area of work in 2021?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, a large part of what we're going to be focused on in 2021 is around just, you know, continuing the work and continuing the organizing. I think there may be a temptation to, right after these really difficult for years for so many people to relax and sit back and take a break. And I think, you know, we're really focused on an understanding that, well, obviously, you know, we want everyone to stay in this for the long haul and take care of ourselves. That, you know, white nationalist and anti-immigrant and paramilitary movements are not going anywhere. They're not, you know, there's no putting things, you know, back in the box. There never was. But I think we can use the greater awareness of these movements and how dangerous they are to more strongly organize against their efforts to build political power. I think there are some things that we expect, especially from the anti-immigrant movement, that we're preparing for. We expect them to, play a more defensive role, doing what they can to work against efforts to undo President Trump's anti-immigrant policies, or work against any more immigrant, pro-immigrant rights policies that may be proposed. I think it's going to be important to keep an eye on where key immigration policymakers, many of whom left anti-immigrant groups and joined DHS or the Trump administration, end up. I think it's likely that some will go back and work for anti-immigrant groups, but others could go to the Hill or other policy places. And I think there's a likelihood that some white nationalist groups will operate sort of in a somewhat more undercover way, but I think it's going to be there is still going to be an urge for them to seek some publicity and to really organize. And so we're really focused on keeping up the energy to make sure that these dangerous bigoted groups don't gain any more political hold in our system, and hopefully we can continue to work and support communities and institutions to limit the impact of their bigotry.
Well, like I said in the presentation, the immigrant threat narrative is not going away, but I think with the new administration and maybe even a new Congress with a Democratic majority, that there may be more political space for the counter narrative that I tried to present. I think also that in the new year, we may see some strengthening of organized labor, which I would hope would embrace some of these ideas and promote them. So I guess like everybody, I've been sleeping a little better since we learned that Biden had won the election. And I know that we'll have a new set of problems once he takes office. But I do think that there will be more opportunity to debate these things without the threat narrative dominating the entire conversation.
Yeah, we're really excited about this narrative change work in 2021. A thing we really want to do is ramp up our deep canvassing and learn to use it in different ways. And so in the past, our project has been connected to a research project. So we're really excited to maybe utilize deep canvassing more on our own issues, with the goal of either flipping a district or passing a bill or defeating a bill, or even utilizing our deep canvassing tactics in our GOTV work. We're really excited about the possibility of doing that. And then we also like the idea of maybe being able to train others in Tennessee to utilize deep canvassing and to be a thought partner for them, or just a way to get that effort going more across the state. So whether it's us canvassing on our own issues or helping other organizations set up these projects, it's something we're really excited to explore.
And thank you again, Rinku. Can you share a challenge you overcame or an important lesson you have learned through your work?
Yes, I'm happy to share a challenge or an important lesson. I think for these purposes, the one that I'm focused on is that when you know a lot about a topic, it's very easy to want to just share everything you know all the time with everyone you come across. And when our ideas are challenged, it's very easy to just pull up all of the data that I know we have that proves our point and why we are correct. But what I have learned is that that doesn't always work. Being right, being correct, isn't being factual, not lying, is not always, and I could even say often, is not enough to move someone who is taking the opposite position from you. And that what you have to do, instead of rushing toward all the data that you have and throwing it at people, is try to understand why they've taken the position that they've taken. Do your best to empathize with that. That is very difficult. I have a really hard time doing it myself, but even people who oppose us, there is something there for us to connect with, and it's important to make that connection. And then to step away from the data actually and think more about values and emotion and story in the intervention. So I might feel a little less correct, but actually be more effective if I can connect with the person I'm trying to persuade.
And Kayse, it's great to share the Northwest with you, but I had a question. What partnerships have you created to strengthen your work and build solidarity across movements in Oregon or even beyond?
Thank you, Rich. I think this is a really important question. So I'm going to give you an example. A few years ago, United Oregon was trying to build a movement around ending profiling campaign. And what we're able to do is that we kind of find out who are the segments of the community that we want to build a relationship with and be bringing to the table to help us to pass this policy. So with that, we approached the labor partners and colleagues in the state, and we let them know that we want them to be at the table and work with us on this ending profiling campaign. And we make the case that their members are actually impacted by, particularly those who are community of color and Black and brown community members who are, either being profiled when they drive into work or, coming back from work. And it's actually economic. We create also economic narrative around saying that, if you've been stopped and being given a ticket, one of your members, they have to take a day off from work to deal with that. And that's just puts a strange challenge on the family, economic issues, and making sure the folks have ability to address their issues by missing a working day. And that's economic justice for your members. We went to the houseless community and we told them that, houseless community is one of the biggest impacted by, either housing sweeps that is happening in Oregon, or dealing with the police. And we asked them that they should be coming to the table working with us, and that's how we brought them as well. We talked to the LGBTQ community members and we said, this is an issue that also impacts you as part of your community, and we want to be building a coalition together to address a collective power. But more importantly, the policy that we put together had all those elements impacted communities to address their issues around encounters that they have with the police. So that's how we built a collective power, and it was very strong coalition, and we were able to pass very strong policy across the state that really created a data collection, in terms of the racial profiling in Oregon, but also the criminalized possession of small drugs, of usable drugs, and that really impacted all those communities and really, really helped us to take us to the finish line. And that's kind of example that how we can build a collective power coalitions that really can benefit everybody that you brought to the table.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers, panelists, for their insights and the stories that they've shared. I had one more question for all of them. And that is, please share your call to action. We're all organizers here. So what do you want attendees to walk away with? And what are some resources and action items we need to follow up on?
Yeah, my call to action for folks who are watching this session is to get ready to tell your story, no matter who you are in relation to the immigrant rights movement, whether you're an immigrant yourself or you are first generation, second generation, or not an immigrant, but deeply attached to the movement, doing well. Tell your story and think about how you came to take action, to be able to take action, and tell that story, because we really need to encourage people to continue the great organizing that has started over the last 10 years and the huge kind of uptick in organizing and protest and resistance and advocacy over the last few years in particular. So we want to keep that trend going, and a great way to help it keep going is to talk about how you came to be active on this issue, what kinds of things you've done, how you learned about it, and what you've won, even if those victories have been small. So tell your story to whoever you can get to listen to it.
Yeah, I think what I'd really like to leave folks with is the sense that there's a real opportunity here to build on our wins and to build on the fact that the majority of Americans do agree with some of our core values. And I think it's going to be important to continue our momentum and remember that the white nationalist movement isn't going away. So we still need to ensure that we're building that understanding into our organizing moving forward, so that the new wins and victories and progress towards justice that we get isn't rolled back in the future by these dangerous bigoted movements.
Thank you, Rich. I think for me, one thing that I want to share with you is that finding unusual partner that you haven't had before, it's important. And many times, as I can attest, is that those organizations like United Oregon, or who are mainly led by people of color, immigrant refugees, a lot of times, and I know every state's different, but a lot of times we've been invited to the table, and a lot of times those invitations are kind of comes across as a tokenizing as a, rather than being brought as a full partner. So I want to ask you to think about turning the tables around and really inviting unusual partner that you haven't had before, and bring those partners to the table, and but also making sure that we show them how to do it, and we create a space where you're co-creating at the table, you're co-creating the partnership, and also the whatever work that you're doing, whether it's a policy or movement building, that it's benefiting from everybody, but also really emphasizing a lot that making sure it's also centered the community that you're working with, so you don't compromise your work that you're supposed to do, but ensuring that whatever policy or work that you're doing, it's actually benefiting for everybody that you brought to the table. So in another word, you're really showing your partners how to do build a collective power, how to create a genuine partnership. So that my encouragement to you all today is that go out there and find unusual partner you haven't had before, and then do the hard work of creating meaningful partnership.
I think the main thing is to have a clear understanding of the sequence of events that have led to the growth of low-wage immigration side by side with transformation of the U.S. labor market. But in terms of the call to action piece, I think for me, the key is to figure out how to build coalitions between the labor movement and the immigrant rights movement. I mean, that's happened in the past. I think under Trump, we've all been kind of derailed, and it's time to consolidate that alliance and find ways to build unity among U.S.-born workers and their foreign-born co-workers. So that's the takeaway, I think, from what I've been trying to say.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. The first thing, and I've said this in my presentation, is that, a lot of people, again, are intimidated to enter into these conversations. Maybe not people on this call, since this is your work, but I just really want people to understand that you don't have to be a policy expert, and you don't have to have all of the facts right to enter into a productive conversation with other people to help move them. You just have to be willing to ask good questions and to sit in those difficult moments. And what I tell our canvassers is, if you hit a place where you feel like the conversation's really gone off the deep end, you can always bring it back to compassion. So you can always say, I'm not a policy expert, but I really want the people in my community, in our state, in our country to be treated with compassion. That's what I'm really interested in. And I think that's a way to kind of humanize the issue for people. The other thing I would say is, this is what I challenge people with at the end of the transformative conversations training, is I say, we're all, we're isolated right now, we're in this pandemic, but you could take this opportunity to call someone in your life who is maybe conflicted on these issues of immigration or another issue, and engage them in one of these conversations. And again, you can do so not sort of armed with your fact sheet, but you can do so in more of a curious way, and actually wanting to understand why they hold the concerns that they hold, and to try to sort of delve into and unravel that a little bit more. And I always tell our canvassers too, like, if you are not sure what to say, or you feel like you've asked enough questions, ask one more, right? So just be ready to ask a lot of those questions. And I think that can be really disarming for that person, particularly because I know sometimes these conversations can be hard with close friends and family.
And thank you to all of you who participated in the session. And it's the end of the first day here at the NIC, the National Immigrant Integration Conference. So glad to be here with all of you. Really excited by all the sessions, these breakouts, as well as the fabulous plenaries. We invite you to participate in the important sessions coming up the rest of this week and tomorrow. And thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you.